looking at certain aspects of vocabulary that are very important to know in order to get a good score in the vocabulary criteria, the lexical resource. And we're also going to have a look at how you can learn vocabulary, how you can use vocabulary, okay, with your network. I think there's a lot of people online at the moment with all of the lockdowns, so it's struggling, I think, a little bit. Just again, one request, please, guys, could you keep everything in the chat in English? This is public. I don't want to be responsible for things that are written up that I don't understand, okay? So please keep everything in the chat in English. Let's have a look. So the first aspect that we are looking at is connotation. So what does that mean? When we talk about connotation of certain words, what are we talking about? Morning, Rasim. We're looking at connotation. Neo, that's a good way. The feeling of the word or background meaning. It's often, does it have a negative or does it have a positive connotation? So it can actually change what you're saying and the idea of what you're saying to a very great extent, knowing whether, you know, this is positive or negative. So you could use the word strong. We're really focusing on adjectives right now just for this. So Lance put motivation. What other words could you think of to describe that picture? Sisyphus. Yes, it is. It's Sisyphus pushing the challenging. We've got inspiring. That's quite good. We've got quite a lot of positive words coming out of that. Struggling, effort, some hard work, tough, tiring. If we look at one word, if we look at the word difficult, does that have a positive or a negative connotation? If you say something's difficult, that's not a positive idea. That's definitely a negative idea. However, as some of you have already said, how could you make it more positive? Some of you put inspiring, hardworking. I think challenging is a good. Somebody said suffering would be another negative word to use. Inspiring, challenging, trying hard is a more positive way. So we can look at it in different ways, and the word that you use will automatically have a certain feeling for the person you are talking to. So, you know, it's very important the examiner understands if you're being positive or negative. So we're going to look at some other words where there's a positive and a negative way of doing it. Relentless, Anima, that would be a very negative way. And it was Sisyphus. It was a relentless task, wasn't it? A never-ending task. So if we have a look at the picture here, if we said skinny, would that be positive or negative? Definitely. So that's a very negative word to use about somebody. There's some great words coming up here like meek and things like that. I like the teacher's pet. Okay, 100% negative if you use the word skinny. So how could you make it more positive? How would you like? Slim is very nice. Bony, we would have really more as a negative word. Okay, so slim, slender, fit is also a nice way of saying it. As Olga, I think, mentioned, you know, you can also have neutral words. So thin is really kind of quite a neutral word. It's not particularly positive or negative. So we can have positive, we can have negative, but we can have also quite neutral words that we often use more in the writing in IELTS. Maybe not positive anymore, no. But the meaning of slender is that it's like a compliment. If you say that somebody, oh, you're looking very slender, that's a compliment. If you say to someone, you're looking very skinny, it's just to be funny, then that's definitely not a compliment. That's an insult. So remember, it's how it's intended to feel. For lean is also positive. Svelte, brilliant word. Again, very positive to use to describe that about somebody. So they have these connotations. You can't change the connotation. Those connotations are set. So if we've got here, we're looking at the clothes here in particular. Okay, so let's, hi Lizzie. If you say somebody's wearing vintage clothes, okay, we've got some words there like classic. Okay, that's a very positive word that has the idea of very stylish. Posh is nice. I saw classic, elegant, retro. These are all very, very nice words that you could choose. If you wanted to be negative, how would you make it? Yeah, okay. So we could say that she was dressed in a very old-fashioned way, and that or outdated, very nice. Outdated is a really good word. So outdated or old-fashioned or unfashionable, Sarah, as well. Those would be ways to make it sound more negative. So yeah, vintage, retro, classic, very positive, old-fashioned, outdated, unfashionable. Now we're having a look at this one. Corny is like funny in a really bad way. So like a bad joke is corny. So fussy is nosy is a good word as well. If you describe someone as being fussy, then that's again a very negative word. So someone who pays too much attention to detail. So they don't like this, they don't like this. It's got to be exactly like that. Picky mudra, again, word to use if you want to be negative. Demanding, Jemmy, again, very negative connotation there. Finicky, Lan, excellent. I like that very much. That's great. Maybe judgmental, yeah, in a certain one. If we wanted to be positive, so a few people have already put careful, that's good. Precise, meticulous, fastidious, okay, accurate, focused, if we were doing the adjective. So we went for meticulous. Perfectionist. Perfectionist is a funny one. It can have a bit of a negative connotation. Perfectionist, like that the person is never happy. So maybe that's a cultural thing, but I think in the UK, that's a bit negative. Conscientious, Nagisa, that's a great word. Micromanaging, very negative connotation if you say that somebody is micromanaging. Rigorous would be a good positive word to use. Finicky is the same as fussy. So fussy, picky, finicky, all have the same meaning, like never happy, basically, and nothing's right except the one thing that's right. Scrupulous is a good word as well. Okay, so we'll have a look. So confident would be positive or negative. So that's definitely a positive word. If you look at that and you think maybe that's not quite, you don't really like him very much, how would you make it negative? Arrogant. Proud is often used negatively when you're as a characteristic, if you're proud, rather than somebody being proud of something. Egotistical, overconfident, complacent. Complacent, yes, Gulmira, that's idiot. Certainly negative. We're trying to be a bit more focused. Okay, boastful, very good. Conceited, Alpha, that's also looking cocky, Lillian. If you want to be informal, cocky's a very good word. Self-assured, I'd say, is quite positive. It's quite a positive word to use. Self-reliant, again, positive, that would be quite good. So this is the last one. Greedy, we've gone for the word stingy. So is stingy positive or negative? Very negative. Got a lot of good words coming up. Gold digger, greedy. Selfish is maybe not quite precise enough. You could say obsessive. I saw miser, miserly. That's quite a good word as well. Maybe materialistic. If you add IC, Jemmy, then you make the adjective. Penny pinching. So how could you actually, how could you make that a positive thing? this idea of, yeah, well, maybe hardworking, but we're focusing a little bit more on the money. Yeah, maybe economical, careful, prudent, thrifty. It's the one that we went to. Frugal, truck, that's a very nice word. So specifically thinking about someone who's careful with money, but wanting to make it a positive thing. Thrifty, frugal, prudent, careful, these kind of words would be to use. Sparing, that one, that's good as well. Parsimonious is a good word, but it's quite negative. Just to finish off on the connotation, so we got some more words here which have the same meaning if you looked in a dictionary, but you have to be careful again. So yeah, childish, very negative, but youthful would be very positive. What about the next one? What's the kind of the positive way, or not the negative? So in some exceptional cases, so somebody can be exceptionally talented or exceptionally intelligent. It's a positive thing. What about the next one? So which one works in the sentence? Shortening the word down. Yes, assertive. So again, assertive has a very positive idea, but pushy, very negative. If you describe someone as pushy, then you're definitely criticizing them. What about the next one? Don't be cheap. So again, cheap, if you describe something as cheap, that's always negative, but as we saw before, economical is a good positive word to use in this case. Also, if you describe a product, if you say that a product is cheap, it doesn't just mean that it's a low price. It tends to mean that the quality is very poor as well. So better to say something is reasonably priced if you want it to mean that it's low price, but it's also a good thing. So just remember, cheap is negative in every possible way. Okay, notice that it says unprofessional conduct. If you lose your job because you did something wrong, then that would be fired. If you are made redundant, it means that you lose your job because the company needs to save money. Again, you can also say let go or laid off. So fired, you lose your job because you did something wrong. Made redundant, you lose your job because the company needs to save money. So you yourself have not done anything wrong. It's more about the company saving money. We can also say laid off. We can also shown the door. Let go, somebody was let go. So that's a different way. It's not really positive, but it doesn't mean that you did something wrong. Kicked out would be fired. Kicked out would be very negative. That would be or thrown out or kicked out, or their contract was terminated. That would be fired. That would be definitely a negative thing. Or given notice, he said, that's right. Okay. So do be very careful that you are aware of the connotation of the words that you are using. This is true for speaking and writing. So if you think about dictionaries, it's actually better to have an English dictionary, because if you have a English to your own language dictionary, it often doesn't tell you the connotation. So you can end up using a word that isn't appropriate for the situation or for the context that you're using it in. Be very aware of connotation. So the next thing that we are looking at is register. So we had a lot of words that we were looking at there. People were using things like sacked and given notice. So sacked and I will remove you if you don't sort things out. This is public, not happy. If we think about those words, we had sacked and we had given notice. So this is a question of register. The meaning is the same. So we're not, and the connotation is the same, but the register is different. So when we're talking about register, what are we talking about? It could be, Lan, it could be serious. The thing is, the examiner might totally misunderstand what you mean, or what you say doesn't make sense. We got that formal, informal, or the context, as somebody said, or the situation. So for example, we got a very common example here: kids, very informal; children, it's quite neutral, to be honest, but it's fine to use in your writing. If you are doing the writing, if you're doing the academic writing, then everything in your writing must be formal English, very formal academic English. Okay. General training, when you do the letter, sometimes you have an informal letter. So that might be a situation, so that will be a situation where you use informal language. But in your task 2 should still be quite formal. When you do the speaking, whatever, you know, whether you're doing general training or academic, then your speaking should be informal. It's very important that you're showing them that you're able to use the informal language for the speaking and the formal language for the writing. No, there's no mics, Hemaf, I'm afraid, only me. So we're going to look at some other expressions. So I'm going to give you the informal expression, and what I'd like you to do is to give me a formal version which would work in a written context. So yeah, we've had a number of, we've had several, great deal of, that works as well. Simply many works really, really well. Plenty is also informal. So you don't want to be using plenty when you're doing the written test. Many. Bunch of is also informal. So many reasons, we had various reasons, a variety of reasons, things like that. Plethora is maybe a bit too formal, actually. We don't really use that so often. Numerous works very well. Okay, what about the next one? He apologized. Okay, he gave his apologies. You could say he made his excuses. Definitely he apologized is more formal. What about the next one? How are you is just in a more formal setting. You would ask someone how they are with your friends. Fine to say what's up. Okay, profits have gone up. How are you holding up, Chris? That's really good. Informal, but a great expression. Increased, rose, soared. These are all good. Remember, rise is informal. So profits have risen. Okay. Not raise, rise. Climbed is fine, but increased also. Grown, Sarah, yeah. Pop-up would be very informal and not quite the right meaning. Rocketed works well. Discuss. There are other options, maybe present, maybe illustrate, demonstrate. Is about is still a little bit informal. You know, I mean, it's okay, but there are more formal or maybe more academic ways of putting it. Concerned with, something like that. Notice also after discuss, we don't use about. It's quite a common mistake I've seen a lot of people making. So you discuss something, you talk about something. Might be explained, that would be fine as well. Okay, what about the next one? This is something to definitely avoid using. Regarding, considering would work well, with regards to, in relation to. There's quite a few different ones that you can use there. But about, really you want to avoid using that in your formal essays. A few people are putting according to. According to, you need to follow with a person. So according to, the president. You're basically quoting what somebody has said. So it doesn't work in this instance. About is definitely informal. I mean, if you're talking about an academic essay for the IELTS, you really don't want to be using about. Avoid using it in your task 2. Okay, what about this? I totally agree with this. Completely is just, or fully is very, very nice. Wholeheartedly is also very nice. But some of these adverbs like totally, basically, are quite informal. Definitely is also quite informal. That would be, oh, entirely, Alexei, that's a good one. So completely, fully, wholeheartedly, entirely, strongly, those would work well. Totally, definitely, things like that would be, I thoroughly agree with this. Quite formal. That's a nice expression to use. I genuinely agree. I would use genuinely for speaking, but not writing. Utterly, again, I would use for speaking when you're talking about with agree and not for the writing. Okay, what about this? Really big. Okay, so you want to use a better adjective anyway. Okay, big is not a good word to be using when you're doing the writing. But yeah, enormous, devastating. If it's negative, that would work. Huge, immense, things like that. That's quite. Humongous is a great word, but it's very informal, very informal. So again, words like really and pretty, great for the speaking, avoid using them in the writing. So yeah, finally, in conclusion, to summarize, to sum up, those are, last but not least, again, speaking, not writing. Again, make sure you're using the right one when you're speaking. And finally, in a nutshell, people love this expression, in a nutshell, is very informal. Okay, so to summarize, to sum up, to conclude would work for those. So if you look at the first column, they are fine for speaking. In fact, great for speaking. You really want to be using informal language. The ones on the right-hand side, those are what you need to be using for formal writing, or, you know, more formal settings. They can still be speaking, like interviews, things like that. We're going to look at this a little bit more. So just a bit more information. When you're using the formal register, so the writing in IELTS, basically, avoid using any kind of informal vocab, any kind of slang. Abbreviations also, like don't, isn't, you need to avoid in the academic writing, or any kind of abbreviations, things like etc. Don't use that. We're coming to that, Selma. Also, phrasal verbs are not really very useful. Cam, use do not. Phrasal verbs are by their nature informal. And also idioms. So idioms, fine in the speaking, not to be used in the writing. I wouldn't even use and so on, Hannah, to be honest. I would just give some examples and then stop. There's not really any need to say and so on or anything like that. Don't use etc. when you are writing. We're going to look at idioms now. Just say 3 examples, X, Y, and Z. So those are the things that you need to avoid when you're doing your part 2, your task 2 in the writing. Also, if you're doing a formal letter. Phrasal verbs are great for speaking, Rodrigo, but not for writing. We're going to look at this together. So if you look at that paragraph, this is kind of like a summary of what we were saying. Which words or phrases there informal? Which ones would we need to use? So you've got the etc. down at the bottom. In a nutshell, a bit. These are all, if we're thinking about the things that we looked at, they're informal or they're contractions, so they're not right. Awesome is not something that you can use in the writing. So in a nutshell, we already looked at. So in conclusion or to conclude. Rather than guys, absolutely, many people. What about rather than a bit? Individuals, Ati, that works very well as well. Okay, so somewhat is a very nice way of saying a bit more formally. Slightly difficult. Doesn't sound quite right to say slightly. Quite works, quite difficult work. But what about stuff? Things I think works, or a number of things that they can do. Talking about things, we're not talking. Goods is only in relation to trade or business. Factors, that works well. Elements works really well. What about I'd say that? In my opinion, or I believe, those are really good things. Or, you know, simply we have to make sure we're not contracting. Yes, you could say, I can tell it from my perspective, Paria, from my perspective. Want to, so wanna is obviously very, very informal, very slang. What about rather than awesome? Brilliant is still a little bit informal. Yeah, a high score, an impressive score, an excellent score, something like that. That's all very, very good. They work well. Yeah, we'll come into that in a minute, Jemmy. Okay, you had better. Should is neutral, I would say. It's not particularly academic, but it's definitely neutral. So at the end of the day, finally, or ought to, yes, beer, ought to is a good formal version, like the same as should. You're supposed to, it's not quite as strong as should, but it's definitely works well. Overall, generally speaking, to summarize, that works very well. And the last one, so remember what we said, there is no formal version of etc. Don't use and so on. You have to just give a more general way of ending that. Or, like I said, give 3 examples: idioms, abbreviations, and slang. I know it's quite long, but you could just give another example, Zainab. It wouldn't have to be as long as that. But don't use etc. and don't use and so on. That's fine if you just put a point. If you have 2 examples, that's fine. Avoiding idioms and abbreviations, full stop. Salga, on balance, that's a nice expression. That's a very nice formal expression. It doesn't sound quite right to just use 1 example, Sedana. I would always give 2 and maybe 3, but 2 is enough. There's a few other things that are maybe not quite so informal, but they're still better to avoid when you do your writing. So for example, saying you is a bit informal. So we can, you know, we can say that in a slightly different way. So for example, we could say people, or you can be more precise. You can use candidates. That's right, Hannah, you can say one. If you use one, just make sure that you then follow that through ones, and you don't change it. Quite formal. If one wants to get an excellent score, one should make sure one uses. It's like he, she. You can use it in the speaking. It's fine in the speaking. But yeah, candidates, test takers, people, students, those are all fine. And then use, yeah, exactly. Use they. You can use he, she, Jemica, but it can get a bit confusing in a long sentence, because then you have to keep saying he, she, his, her, kind of goes on and on. If you use they, then, you know, oneself, Nagita, yeah, oneself. Or, you know, you just change it completely. You use a passive, or you use an infinitive, and you just avoid the whole question of you. So there's lots of different things you can do. But generally better to avoid that kind of you expression. Somebody did bring this up before, but it was quite a good one. So again, want to, it's not informal, but it's not, you know, if you intend to, if you, yeah, if you desire is maybe a bit too strong. I would say would like, aspire to. So want is one of those, it's not exactly, it's not slang, obviously, but it's not great. We're coming to that in a minute. But rather than get again is just not a good word to use. Maybe pursue, obtain, achieve, those are all good. Reach, those are all. Try and avoid want, try and avoid get, try and avoid big. They're just not really very good words to use. As we already had, very good. Ensure. Okay, so rather than be able or make something possible, ensure. A certain is a good word to use, but it has a slightly different meaning. Also enable, So rather than saying make something possible, it was make sure. So these expressions with make are a little bit informal. So make sure, ensure, make possible is enable. So they work quite well. You know, just try and get the best language that you can.